Hello there. My name's Lee Thurburn, and you have joined Live Stream Lee. And I just want to tell you right now, we had technical difficulties. I'm about a minute late getting started, maybe 2 minutes. And my guest for today is Mike Armour, and I'm thinking he probably got booted, and he's going to be rejoining us in just a moment. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started while I wait for Mike to get reconnected. My internet connection dropped about 1 minute before before we were supposed to start, and I had to go through the reboot process. Here comes Dr. Armour back now. Mike, I see you in the waiting room. I'm getting started. As you know, I dropped my connection, and so I had to reboot my computer. So we're just kind of getting started here. Today, we're going to be talking for the second time, and we're going to be following up on our first conversation about China and the threat that it represents to us here in the United States and the Western world in general. And so Mike is going to be my guest, and we're going to just again continue our conversation. Before I get started, I wanted to cover a couple of things. First of all, I want to invite you to go to apricotrocket.com and create an account. Apricot Rocket is an online technology platform. It is a system similar in many respects to Facebook and LinkedIn, but our purpose is really very simple. It's to help your business get more customers faster so that you can grow faster and become more profitable and have all those kinds of good things happen as a result. An account is free. I just encourage you to go to Apricot Rocket and get set up and get connected up and start building a community. I also want to let you know what's coming up in the next few days. Tomorrow, I'm going to be talking about what I think of as the bleeding edge of marketing. We're going to be talking about Clubhouse and TikTok and live streams and podcasts and things like that. This is digital marketing that is useful whether you're a business to consumer or a business to business type of business. And then on Thursday, a friend of mine, Steve Mangum, is going to be visiting with us. And we're going to be talking about do-it-yourself Amazon stores. You know, Amazon stores can be extremely confusing and complicated to set up. And we're going to be talking about a unique way of getting into the e-commerce business with a complete turnkey do-it-yourself Amazon store. I think you might find that interesting. And then on Friday, a friend of mine named Mike Blake is a custom home builder, kind of in East Texas, really not so much East Texas as just east of Dallas. And he builds, I don't know, 15, 25 homes a year in the $500,000 to $2 or $3 million range. And he's got a very active, very successful business. And, you know, he actually started it right prior to the big real estate depression or recession, I guess let's call it a recession, back in the 2007, 8, 9 timeframe. And his business grew dramatically, and he's got a really nice business now. So we're going to find out from Mike how he did it. One of the reasons you start a business is probably the same as me. It's because we want to be able to sell our business at some point in time in the future. And the thing you don't want to do is wait until the last minute to talk to a guy like Bob Hampton. Bob Hampton is a specialist in business financial planning. And if you don't know what that means, it basically means making sure that you do the correct sequence of things prior to selling your business when you're ready for retirement so that you can get the maximum value out of your business with the minimum tax effect. I mean, it's really all about how much money you have for retirement, and that means as little as possible goes to the federal government. So that's what Bob does. He's in the business of helping business owners plan for that stage of the game. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and I'm going to bring in Mike Armour. And Mike is he's really an interesting guy. He's got a great background. He has a PhD in medieval, I want to call it medieval studies, but he basically studied the 13th to the 15th century European transition from an agrarian to an industrial sort of stage in Western history. And he did that because he was specifically looking for similarities with the kind of the age of the internet. And I know he found quite a few of those. But while Mike is a bright guy and got a very interesting business history as well, today's discussion is going to call upon his 35 years of experience in the naval intelligence community as a Navy officer. Mike, thank you for your service and thank you for joining me today. Appreciate you coming back.
Glad to be part of it.
So I'm going to start this conversation off now. This is part 2. And today we're really going to try to sort of focus on the how your business is going to prepare for that time, which probably, not for sure, but that time of conflict that's real likely to occur in the not too distant future with China. And I want everybody to make a mental note or make a note of Polymatter, Polymatter. Go to YouTube and search for Polymatter China. And there's a guy that has done a lot of research into data, statistics related to China. And I'm going to pull out just a few statistics. I was thinking about putting his graphs up, but then I thought I might be violating copyright. So I'm not going to do that because he's got some great graphs. And I really highly recommend, if you're interested in this topic, go watch. He's got 4 videos on China that are incredibly interesting. But there are 4 main topics, and one in each of these videos, that are pertinent to our conversation. The first is a demographic and age stack, where you basically have rows for what percentage of your population is in certain age clusters, and you just stack them up. And China is rapidly becoming very top heavy. Right now, you have about the same number of people that are in the 10 to 30 year age range that are in the 30 to 65 year age range. In the age range that's above the 65 and older, you have about 5 times as many people in the 30 to 65 group as you do the 65 plus. In 40 years, you're going to actually have about a 1-to-1 ratio in the highly productive earning years of 30 to 65. You're going to have about the same number of people that are in the 65 plus, very top heavy. And what's even more alarming is that the people that are in the 10 to 30 year age range 40 years from now are going to be about half the number that there is in that middle cluster of highly productive people. That's a real challenge for any economy, because that means that you're going to have less people available to perform the work and provide the social services, if you will, the revenue to support social services for your rapidly aging population. Japan went through this not too long ago. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is about 30% of China's GDP relies on real estate investment and development, 18% in the United States. But when you look a little closer, what you see in China is that only 13% of home purchases are first home purchases. In other words, only 13% of the total purchases of homes are going to people that are buying a home for themselves. 67% of home purchases are people purchasing a second home, and 20% of home purchases are people purchasing a third home. Now, you think about it in the United States, people buy second homes for vacation homes and retirement homes. But what do you need a third home for? Well, you need it maybe for rental income. In China, there are over 50 million homes completely vacant. So what you have happening is a complete real estate bubble. Chinese wealth is being artificially propped up by a real estate bubble, which is driven by the fact that there's really not much else that, as a Chinese person, you can invest in to be able to ensure that your earnings have long-term value for your family. So there's a huge real estate bubble. The third thing that's real interesting about China is the incredible acute shortage. And I say acute, as in there's different levels. Acute is the most drastic level of water shortage in China. And the water shortage in China is fundamentally driven by two things. Number one, it's the basically the geographic layout. There's just not that much rainfall in the northern half of China. Most of it's in the southern half, but the northern half of China is where the majority of the industry and the people are, that is not right along the coast. What does this mean? Well, this means that China has a severe difficulty of providing water to its population. And the simplest way to do that would be what we would do here in the United States, is change the price, or basically tax water by increasing the price to reduce the usage. But China can't do that. And China can't do that because it's one of the fundamental sort of things that the People's Republic of China, the Communist Party of China, has provided. And for them to have to jack up the price of water would be to admit failure. So they're spending literally hundreds of billions of dollars in water irrigation redirection projects, which are basically taking their available water and moving it to arid areas, which are causing downstream shortages. So they're really just kind of playing whack-a-mole with the water shortage problem. So why are these things all kind of important to understand? Well, they're important to understand because you have a demographic bubble of lack of ability to support the population that's going to come to a head within the next 40 years. It's irresistible. It's going to happen. Number two, you have a real estate bubble that cannot last forever, because how can you possibly continue to build and sell properties that are empty without some sort of revenue to support them financially? That's number two. That's going to have to come to a collapse. Number three, you have water supply issues that are pervasive. And now in the last 10 years, you've seen China begin doing something you haven't seen before. And that is a heightened level of antagonism towards the Western world. And if you look at charts about the perception of China that exist in the Western world, in the last 10 years, China's aggressive anti-Western rhetoric has increased to the point where every single European and Western country is beginning to view China as a threat. Why in the world would they be rattling the saber and talking tough and making statements? Because the only way that they can continue to support their failed economic system, they see what happened in Russia. The only way they can continue to support their failed economic system is to ratchet up the nationalistic fervor by causing problems that make it look like it's us versus the world, China versus the world. That's the backdrop of our current situation. Mike, did I miss anything?
No, that's a pretty thorough summary of the dynamics that are all coming together to give Chinese leadership the perfect storm to confront. And you're right to point out that there are many similarities here with what happened in Russia. Russia found itself with an economy that was failing and an aging population, and the infrastructure just would not support itself. In Russia, the death rate was exceeding the birth rate. Was exceeding the birth rate. And so your population was in absolute decline. And when your population is declined, businesses can't build and thrive. So when Russia came out from under Marxism, they have struggled ever since to really establish local economies because of that. China's got something of the same scenario shaping up down the line, in that there won't be a place for people who want to start businesses to have nearly the customer base to support the number of businesses that you're going to need in order for there to continue to be upward mobility economically by the people.
So, we talked last Monday, a week ago yesterday, about what I put forth, and you had a slightly different take on it. But what I put forth as a fear that in the next 5 years to 10 years, we're headed towards a military conflict with China because of their military sort of buildup and their posturing over the South China Islands, South China Sea Islands. And you brought in the dynamic I wasn't aware of, that in the next 5 years, we probably don't have much to worry about because they're dependent upon the oil transport through the Malaysian Pacific, South Pacific area.
The Straits of Malacca in particular.
But in about 5 years, they're going to finish building a pipeline over the Andes, I think, to Pakistan, which will give them
over the Andes, Himalayas. Wrong continent. If they can build a pipeline from China over the Andes, they're much better engineers than we think they are.
Right. So over the Himalayas, but that'll give them an alternate energy source. What else are we missing here? Now, you think that it'll be somewhere 5 years plus. So you think that we're in pretty good shape not to have to worry about a hot war with China for that length of time. But what do you have? I mean, so, talk to me a little bit about when you think the threat's going to arise, and what do you think prudent companies will do, and when should they begin planning for the conflict, which could very well shut down, even if it doesn't become a really hot war, it could shut down a lot of supply chains. What do you think companies should be thinking in terms of, and how should they be positioning themselves?
Well, I believe that even small companies need to take part, in a limited way at least, in an exercise that Shell Oil Company pioneered, which is called not contingency planning, but scenario planning. Shell Oil Company, like Exxon Mobil, all the big ones, were completely caught off guard by a perfect storm that came together for them surrounding the Persian Gulf oil embargo of the 70s, which happened to coincide with the rise of the environmental movement in the United States, which was beginning to oppose further development of petrochemicals. And all of a sudden, that plus the rising tensions in the Middle East with the PLO's aggression, the oil industry suddenly found itself facing unprecedented problems that they had no plan for contending with. And so Shell's reaction to that was, once a year, they would have a scenario, some disruption in the world that they would talk through and think through in brainstorming sessions with executives. And then the next year they would have another problem and another problem. None of the scenarios they ever played out or that they ever studied actually played out. But what happened was that when things did happen later, they were not anticipating, they could go back to the scenarios and say, oh, this is sort of like what we talked about then, and we had a plan as to how we would deal with that. How can we take those ideas and apply them to this situation? So it wasn't so much that they anticipated a crisis and planned so that they were ready when it came. They drew on what they had learned as they thought through various disruptive scenarios. And I think we're in a world in which businesses increasingly have to think through what they would do in various disruptive scenarios. Now, small businesses can't devote the resources to it that Shell did, and I'm not suggesting that, but I'm just saying that the top leadership of any company needs to have some time in a retreat setting or other places where periodically they look at what could disrupt their business and what they would do if something like that were to occur. Because I think the bottom line is that whatever plays out with China, we'll be surprised. Didn't quite see it playing out that way. We didn't quite anticipate that. Going back to some of the things we said last week, it may actually begin with some kind of push and shove with India, because India is very concerned about Chinese expansionism, as we talked about then. As a consequence, it's not so much planning for a particular contingency, but having the benefit of unhurried thought now in advance to think through what would we do if China and the U.S. were to finally suddenly find themselves at odds militarily. Now, there's an aspect of this that I think we really have to keep in mind. We as Americans have been blessed by the fact that the oceans on each side of us have protected us from being the battlefield for global wars. We fought the wars in Asia. We fought them in Europe. Those economies were destroyed. Our people don't have any experience with a foreign invader attacking our soil. I think one of the greater dangers is that China will do something that looks like they're staging an attack on our homeland with a ballistic missile. Okay. They don't have to have a Navy off our shore. They've got the ballistic capability and the space capability. They could maybe take out one of our satellites or do something like that. And suddenly the realization will hit home that we could be having our cities bombed from the skies. What that does to us psychologically will be as disruptive to business as the disruption of the supply lines. So there are a lot of variables at play here that no one can predict. And that's why I said the moment that it comes is probably going to surprise all of us because we didn't quite think it through that way.
You know, one of the things that I keep thinking about is, nobody likes the idea of kicking the can down the road for the next generation.
All right.
The current Communist Chinese Party leadership is particularly powerful, and they're at a sort of a nexus point where they have kind of everything going their direction. Mm-hmm. They're on the heels of about 2 decades worth of rapid economic improvement. They're probably about as popular as they're ever going to be. They see the negatives coming, and they know that they're 5 or 10 years out before they begin to be undeniable. And so if they wait 5 or 10 years, they may very well sort of miss the point. They may go to the ledge and then over to the point where they don't have the kind of hold on their population that they currently do. You know, the internet makes it possible for a lot of outside ideas to get in. Even though they lock it down, there's got to be a lot more liberal thought, in their minds, liberal thought going on than there ever has been. The number of people that have lived outside of China and come back and bring a perspective of outside news and cultural influence is at sort of, I mean, the pervasiveness and the sharing of that information is only going to make it tougher. There's kind of, I see a window of maybe 5 to 10 years where they either act or maybe they lose the opportunity to act. And I'm wondering whether or not this is part of the heightened aggressive rhetoric, because they're trying to whip the population frenzy up to do something. And I just I worry about that. I worry about that because, while I don't think there's any way they could go toe to toe with the United States militarily or economically at this point in time, we get weaker and they get stronger for the next 5 or 10 years. And then after that, it's hard to know.
Right.
What's your level of concern about the scenario playing out? Do you think it's a high probability, a low probability? I mean, where do you place it on the spectrum of probability and time?
Well, if I look at the history of Marxist economies and Marxist governments, they have all gotten through threats to their existence by casting themselves as the likely victim of some outside force that's out to destroy them. That worked very well in Russia because Russians have, because of the conditioning of their own history, a real paranoia about the world. Everybody has invaded Russia and marched across it and destroyed cities and changed regimes. The Mongols from the east, the Germans and the French from the west. And so the Russians have a natural paranoia about the world that the Marxist government was able to capitalize on. I think part of what is happening is that the Chinese leadership is playing from that same paranoia-inducing script, because when people are afraid, they not only don't think clearly, in fact, neurologically, when fear takes us over, the prefrontal cortex, where we do our highest level thinking, actually begins to shut down, and we become more reactive than reflective. And so once you can create enough fear and paranoia, people won't question you as much because survival is at stake, and they're not thinking as widely and as broadly as they might otherwise do. So I think that's what's playing out. Now then, how much of the rhetoric behind what the Soviet Union was saying was really grounded in reality, and how much of it was for domestic consumption? We're beginning to realize that there were a lot of things the Russians understood their limitations. They understood they could push things only so far. The question is, do the Chinese understand that? The Chinese, unlike the Russians, have a millennia of history as being people of great ingenuity, great imagination, great empire building. I was doing some research the other day on the crossbow and did not realize the sophisticated crossbows that the Chinese had developed long before anyone in the West had them, and the tactics they were using in their military by using formations of soldiers with crossbows to attack the enemy at a distance that the enemy could not respond on the battlefield. So they know that they've got a history of creating new capabilities and new tactics, new approaches, new strategies that have served them very well. And unlike the Russians, who didn't have a long history of being effective, China looks back on its history with pride that we have been at the forefront of the world before we can be there again. So I'm concerned, if anything, that they will miscalculate because they have this greater confidence in their ability to deal with a threat than was the case with the Russians.
Yeah, I don't think if I don't know Chinese history that well, but I don't think they were ever actually overcome by an outside foe. Mm-hmm. They had plenty of fighting within the Chinese borders as they were developing a sense of nationhood, but they never succumbed to an outside enemy. And once that the empires were established, they basically kept themselves intact, albeit with regime changes. They kept themselves intact as a people. And so they don't think of themselves as being able to be conquered because it's not part of their history. That's right. So that same kind of plays into what you're talking about. So, all right. So let's go through a quick list. We have a few more minutes. Let's go through a kind of a quick list of the kinds of scenario planning or contingency planning things that people with businesses should do. Now, I think the obvious ones are, if you have supply chain elements that run through China or Chinese controlled territories, you should obviously begin looking at alternate supply lines, alternate supply sources. So that's a pretty obvious one. What can you add to that might be not quite as obvious?
Well, I would expand it not to only be Chinese supply lines, but increasingly, we're very dependent upon places like India. If we have war that is shutting down the South China Sea and the Straits of Malacca, India has the option, of course, of shipping around the Horn of Africa to us. But as more and more companies are building strategic alliances with Vietnam and with India and other nations to produce things that once we depended upon China solely to produce, there will be a vulnerability there that's a ripple effect. So don't think just about China. Think about South Korea. Think about Vietnam. Think about Indonesia. Think about India. What do we depend on from those areas? And if there are things that you depend on, then what is our contingency if that line of supply were left off? I think another thing that companies need to be thinking through is what a war like that would do to their market. I would anticipate that if the sabers rattle very loud, the stock market will plunge because fear in the investor community will set in, that we're about to go to war and I better, get my money out right now. If the stock market were to plunge in the wake of heightened hostilities or a spirit of hostility between the U.S. and China, then what does that do to my marketplace here? Do people quit buying? Do people quit looking for the kinds of products we offer? If what I'm selling is a very discretionary product instead of a subsistence product, how quickly will people divert their monies that would normally go into peripheral purchases to things that are more essential? Undoubtedly, inflation will take off, prices will go up, and so people will be trying to protect their buying power. So there are a lot of layers to this thing to think through. It's not just the supply chain, it's also markets that will be so psychologically impacted by what's happening that it limits an ability to continue to do business as usual. We got through the Vietnam War with a lot of political unrest and social unrest, but not a lot of economic unrest. Businesses went on doing what they had always done because the war was over there. We've done the same thing with the Persian Gulf Wars and the Afghanistan War. But this time, the threat will be there, and China will not hesitate to rattle this saber. That we've got intercontinental ballistic missiles we can drop on your city with just a moment's notice. And that I'm as concerned about the psychology of that and what it does to us as a people as anything, because we're just not used to thinking in those terms. We've never had to. Once we threw the British out, we haven't had to worry about fighting a foreign power on our soil. And so we've got generations that have never given that any thought, but our generation might be confronted with the possibility that that's imminent.
I think it would be real interesting to explore this topic in even greater detail. It sounds to me like companies that have discretionary, luxury, non-essential products that don't cross over into the essentials realm probably should be looking at how do they get a footprint in the essentials, even if it's not currently a significant piece of their revenue pie. It might be the thing that saves them in the event of a worst case scenario kind of coming to life.
Right.
Mike, we're out of time. We're going to have to draw this one to a close for today. Hang out for a few minutes afterwards. I want to chat with you, but I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you again for being my guest and joining me today. I really appreciate your insight and found your thoughts to be very, very, just great. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
All right. I'm going to, and folks, by the way, Mike, before I go, give your website out. I'm going to put it on the, when I post this video to YouTube and LinkedIn, I want to make sure I've got your website out there. How do people get in touch with you?
Leaderperfect.com, the word leader and perfect put together, because we're about helping leaders perfect their game. And so that's the way to remember. And I'll be glad to respond to any inquiries people have about either what we're talking about or the services that my leadership development firm offers. Thank you, Mike. And folks, you can connect to Mike on LinkedIn. Not a whole lot of people spell Armour, A-R-M-O-U-R. So go look for Michael Armour on LinkedIn and connect up to Mike. He's he's easy to find that way as well. Leaderperfect.com and Michael Armour. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Okay. Before I close, I just want to say one more thing. You see the shirt behind me. I'm kind of pointing right there. You can't really see. Let's see if I can get my fingers to point. There we go. You can't really see the, there we go. I'm going to point. So that's my logo. Not that you can see it or you want to buy the shirt. You probably, like me, have a company that has a logo. And if you want to get your, some branded clothing, go to
livestreamlee.com, and you're going to see a link for Bob Hurt. Bob's been in the corporate apparel business for over 50 years. That's a long time. He is a master. He knows all the different ways of decorating, and he's got the best suppliers. He's got the best prices, and he can save you a lot of time trying to figure out what the right combination is. If you're looking for corporate branded apparel or apparel branded for your kids' baseball or soccer team or whatever, give Bob Hurt a call. Go to livestreamlee.com and click on the Bob Hurt button to get in touch with him. He's great at what he does. And last but not least, go to apricotrocket.com, create an account, and let us help you get some clients. Thank you for visiting today, and come tune in tomorrow where we talk about the bleeding edge of marketing. Cheers.